with you in one moment. Okay. All right. So let's begin, right? So anyway, welcome again to our summer series, NewRoAR, around the reading of the book, The Rage of Innocence. And I'd like to welcome Professor Henning here with all of us. I want to start out by saying that I met Professor Henning a couple of years ago at Georgetown University in terms of being engaged with the policy, the center. Professor Henning, what the exact name is what now?
So it was the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform.
Here we go.
Yeah, yes. Which is housed at our School of Public Policy. And yeah, we met through that. I was one of the teachers in that. And
yes.
There, so.
Yes. And then this past year, for those of you engaged in New Rochelle, you know that, or perhaps need to realize that Judge Rice is leading an effort here in the city of New Rochelle around the Opportunity Program for those who are involved in the criminal justice system, and specifically to provide opportunities for second and third and fourth, if need be, fourth chances in moving forward. And so as a group of us went out to DC once again to participate in this particular kind of a experience for of us that was grounded in anti-racism as a foundational principle for it. Having said that, for tonight, what we'd like to be able to do certainly is not to hear me talk, right? You're not here to hear me. You're here to hear Professor Henning. And so what I'd like to be able to do is to enter into a conversation with her around some questions about the book and quite frankly about herself, and to then save time in our meeting for any questions that you might have. So that will kind of be our format for tonight. We'll have a moderated discussion and then open it up to any questions that you might have. As you know, here in New Rochelle, we've recently had a tragedy occur, the second within 3 years of a resident in New Rochelle involved in a police shooting that resulted in their life being taken from them. And in both instances, these were Black men. And so having said that, it seemed to me that this kind of a conversation, and to us, is an important conversation for us to have, not only to match the moment, but also to match our history and our understanding of each other. So having said that, I'd like to start out, Professor Henning, if you don't mind, I'm going to go through a number of questions, and please take your time and feel free to answer in the way that I'm sure you will. So I'll start out with the first question. And it was interesting because we talked a little bit about this. So I think we're going to be interested in your interpretation of this. The cover of your book, by the way, is very powerful. Can you describe it for our listeners and tell us how it depicts or represents the content of your book?
Great question. So the cover is really a bullseye. It's a silhouette of a young Black boy with a bullseye, on his back, for lack of better words. And it's clearly meant to depict Blackness, childhood school, and the idea being that no Black child today can walk through America without being the target of some sort of discrimination, whether that's in civil spaces, or public spaces, meaning the schoolhouse, his, her, or their own community, their neighborhood, sitting on their front porch, right? And when I think about a bullseye, I'm not thinking about even state actors. I'm thinking about an average, citizen, average resident of America who perceives a Black child to be frightening, right? Who might call the police on that child. I'm also thinking about a Black child with a target on their back as being targeted in the mental health space, the recreation space, the job space, all the spaces in which one needs to grow and develop. And so that is really what it means. And I think in the book, all of those pieces are grappled with in some way or another. And I will say that the book cover was done by Oliver Mundy. For any of you who are familiar with his work, he's an artist who specializes in social justice art. And so his work appears on magazines or books, all of which are dedicated to these conversations around social justice. So when I needed a book cover, I said to my publisher, if you let me choose, I would love anything, by Oliver Mundy. And they were going to hire him, commission him to draw something for my book. And I had a collection of artwork from him. And I identified that particular cover as one of 5 covers that or 5 images that I was interested in. And literally by fluke, it just so happened that was it was drawn by him, but was a freestanding image that had not yet been assigned to a book or to a magazine. And so they were able to purchase it and allow us to use it for that. But it was just so perfect.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think that's great to hear that, because we were wondering about that. We came up with a whole bunch of reasons, ourselves. And so it's good to hear you say that. But, you touched on something that I kind of want to highlight that, and I want to quote it as well, because I think it's really something that's kind of staggering a little bit. And you write that America's obsession with incarcerating Black America begins with Black children. That's a powerful statement. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So what I mean by that is that so much of the conversation today about criminal legal reform, and to a lesser extent, police reform, has been about the adult criminal legal system, and probably not even intentionally. It's just where the conversation goes, where city leaders enter the space in thinking about reform. But my goal is to get folks to really pay attention to the cradle to prison pipeline, and to think about the unique vulnerabilities of children in the criminal and juvenile legal space. And so many of the core features of mass incarceration start with children, right? Prosecution, for example, of folks for low-level offenses in misdemeanor court. Well, think about that in juvenile court, and I write about this a lot, the prosecution of normal adolescent behaviors, things that all children do. That starts very, very, very early on. And in a lot of ways, it becomes a conditioning children, and particularly children of color, right, to be to be policed, to have fears about what it means to be policed. Also, to the extent that we understand mass incarceration, criminalization, and policing as a mechanism of social control, think about how incredibly efficient, if you will, it is to begin that criminalization process, that social control process in those early years, childhood years and adolescent years, before teenagers grow up, assert their own independence, fight back, claim their right in society. So I think about criminalization, among teenagers as early mechanisms of social control. And I think the other thing to think about, really, if you pause for a moment, right, it is no coincidence that so many of the most publicized allegations of police brutality or of violence against Black America involves adolescence, right? So I think all the way back to like the Scottsboro boys. Those boys were 13 to 19 years old, right? When they were falsely accused of raping two women, right, on a train in Scottsboro, Alabama, right? That's, teenagers falsely accused. You think about George Stinney, the youngest person ever executed in 20th century America, was 14 years old, accused of murdering two young white girls. That was in 1944. Again, a huge early statement. Think about Emmett Till, executed, if you will, lynched at the age of 14 in 1955. All of these are setting the early foundation for the limitations of what it means to be a Black teenager or Black child growing up in America. So that's what I mean when I talk about that.
Well, thank you. Thank you. In listening to you and in reading this book, one of the things that I was struck by was that it's not strictly and only an academic text, right? That you seem to weave together different stories as well as research to make your point. Can you tell us a little bit around why you chose that approach in the writing of this book?
Yeah, that was very, very intentional. And I'm clear that, I wanted this book to be a vehicle to change hearts and minds, right? And in order to do that, I think you've got to tell stories. My goal was unequivocally was to allow people, readers, average everyday readers, to find themselves somewhere in one of these stories and to be able to say, oh, I did that when I was a kid. Oh, my son did that last week. And none of I didn't get arrested. My son didn't end up in jail for that. So I wanted to really bring the experience to life in a way that I thought average everyday readers could relate to, with no experience in the juvenile legal system or the criminal legal system. I would love to see this book, and I have to some extent seen this book used as a tool for legislative advocacy or reform. And for many people, legislators, they need to see data, social science research, all of that. And so I wanted to provide that too, but I wanted to provide that in plain language, accessible language woven in with the stories. So it appeals to both types of readers or listeners, because I am well aware that if I just told stories, right, some people would write off those stories as extreme examples, isolated incidents, maybe limited to the District of Columbia or to other high-profile examples that I offer up in this book. But by adding the data and the research, I can complement those and ideally win over hearts and minds of both types of readers.
Okay, thank you. You talk about adolescence here, and in listening to you now and asking you questions about children, I'm wondering, do you have any additional insights about the importance of some of these topics that you describe in the book? You talk about this as some examples around play. You talk about this around examples regarding recreation, as well as leisure in your book. But you do it in a way where I think you're saying to us that we take developmental process for adolescents and including play for granted. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I will say, even since I wrote this book, we have done so much more in the space of recreation, play, and leisure. So I will start by saying that when I wrote this book, I absolutely, you use the word take it for granted. I think I took recreation, play, and leisure for granted. And I think many of us, probably even on this call, did until the pandemic, and we're inside, and we began as adults to realize how incredibly important it is to get outside, play, physically play, enjoy the sun, socialize, all of those things, do something that relieves stress, that makes you laugh. So we take that for granted until we don't have it. But then writing this book, I had no idea or no real appreciation for the developmental necessity of recreation, leisure, and play for healthy adolescent development. And there is an entire wealth of research, social science research on this, how play is, or recreation, however you want to describe it, is necessary for the things that we know about. Obviously, physical exercise, the sun as nutrition, all of that, but also for cultivating leadership skills among teenagers, right? It is on the playground or in your social networks that you really begin to learn empathy, learn loyalty. You learn how to be either a follower or a leader, to allow other people to have an opinion, to respect other people's opinion. You also, during your play and recreation, that's when we were teenagers and figured out what we were good at, whether we were good at athletics, whether we were, and this was especially important for children who are not great in school. They find themselves, they develop self-esteem in that recreation, play, and leisure space. And we take it for granted. Teenagers spend like 40 to 50% of their time every single day free from work, school, and other responsibilities. And so you've got to fill that time with ways that are motivating and rewarding and affirming for young people. Also, recreation, play, and leisure are extraordinarily important for our mental health and for teenagers. Again, developmental necessity, essential for teenagers' health, mental health, and well-being. So giving us sort of stamina and resilience, relief from stress and anxiety, all of those things, joy and laughter, when the rest of my day might be, I feel bad, or I've had stress, anxiety from taking a test, whatever, all of those things. So I'm just sort of going through a couple of pieces about why recreation play is so critical. So here's the deal, how it ties to criminalization. It is especially for Black and brown children who are deprived either through structural racism, i.e. because there are less parks and recreation opportunities in their neighborhood, but then also because there's an increased police presence in Black and brown neighborhoods, so that children who even sit outside on their front porch and socialize, or if they don't have a front porch, right? They live in a housing project and they have recreation, play, and leisure time on the street corner. That might appear to be a nuisance for us, but in fact, that's a part of developmental necessity, right? And yet children, when they get arrested or criminalized in those spaces, that they are conditioned, not to play in those spaces. So thinking about Tamir Rice being one of the most obvious examples, out of Cleveland, playing in a park. And what a lot of people don't realize is that he was playing at the gazebo, but it was right outside of a recreation facility. And he had been in, like, either a gym or something. He had been inside that gym, or it was clear that other kids who sometimes pick on him were in that gym. So he was doing exactly what he should do. Let me just stay outside and enjoy, playing with a toy gun, which so many American children have done, and he gets shot and killed in that space. And so we need to think about play and recreation. So like I said, David, since I wrote the book, we spent the last year and a half at Georgetown and in partnership with the Galt Center, which is formerly the National Juvenile Defender Center, but creating a series of racial justice webinars and meeting with experts in these various fields. And so we have met I didn't even know these existed, but play scholars, people who have devoted their academic career to recreation, play, and leisure. They often appear in departments of forestry or agriculture, or departments of recreation housed at local universities. But we found two African-American scholars in this space who have launched an entire crit play theory, meaning critical race theories around play. How do you understand the deprivation of play among Black and Brown young people? So it's been fascinating to learn. It's been fascinating to think about that as a policy reform initiative, fascinating to think about that litigating as a lawyer, thinking about reforming juvenile and criminal legal systems, or even thinking more importantly about keeping kids out of criminal and legal systems by ensuring safe spaces to play.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I kind of want to tap into and give you some insight a little bit into New Rochelle, because you said something that kind of resonated with me when you were offering that answer around why is it so important for kids to be able to play. And you talked about surveillance, and you talked about the sense of hyper-surveillance in many instances. But all communities in New Rochelle, oftentimes when you say that, what comes up will be around that the differences that occur have more to do with class than race. And so right away, there's this imagery that seems to impact how people think about some of the things that you're describing now. So what do you say to critics who say racial disparity is about class differences, not racial bias? And people, you know, continue to persist in their belief that Black youth commit more crimes because of poverty or violence in their communities. Can you speak to that difference a little bit around, and your thoughts about that?
I mean, people have to understand that race and class are inextricably intertwined in a lot of ways. So there's some, you know, it's hard to say that class it's more about class than race, because they're so interconnected. When we think about all of the historical legacy of structural racism and how structural racism has driven contemporary class differences, it's really becomes impossible to pull them apart. So we think about, you know, the disproportionate presence of Black and Brown folks in poor neighborhoods. I mean, let's just start, you know, there. Or thinking back to, you know, redlining, you know, housing segregation existed and, you know, became the fabric of so many urban plans, you know, small and, you know, large cities, I should say. And so, you know, thinking about like housing segregation, you know, existed and became, you know, synonymous in a lot of ways with poverty. So for me, I think it's a mistake to claim that class is more significant than race. I think also one of the reasons is I think they're both there and they're both important, but that if we don't acknowledge the realities of racial bias and the ways in which it operates, then we aren't going to arrive at the right solutions, right? If we're trying to solve only, you know, part of the problem. And so I talk in the book, and again, I hope I do so in plain language, about the ways in which racial bias operates. And so when I think about, you know, when I think about surveillance, you talked about, and hyper surveillance, and the ways in which Black and Brown children in literally every state in our country are disproportionately overrepresented in police stops and police encounters. That's owing in part to the way racial bias operates. So we think about this notion of class over race. Think about, we have found this wherever you go, for example, that in, let's say, the most rural area that has very few Black and Brown people, let's say you pick a city, rural, you know, county, and it has only 2%, you know, African Americans, without fail, those 2% African Americans will be disproportionately overrepresented in the juvenile and criminal legal spaces, right? Because of that race effect operates at in every regard, and that it becomes critical for us to grapple with the race question and not just the poverty question. So I offer that as well, and I'll continue to think about this question. Yeah, and the other thing, I write about this a bit. I particularly in the criminal legal space, I think I get to, then you all may not have gotten there yet, in chapter 11, this question about poverty, because I think you can't write a book like this and have this conversation without thinking about poverty. And I remember one of the sentences that I wrote, right, that I'm an African-American woman. Obviously, I have a brother, who's African-American, who ended up in the criminal legal system as well. And we came from a middle-class family, right? And what I say in the book is that the disproportionate overreach, hypersurveillance, criminalization, dehumanization of Black families appears at all strata, socioeconomic strata in society, right? But that poverty makes it worse, if that makes sense, right? And so that, I could watch my brother, go through the criminal legal system, and we didn't, as a result, lose our house. We didn't get evicted. But if you're, intertwined with poverty, I see my clients in Washington, D.C., who are poor, living in public housing. You can get evicted. Your entire family can get evicted because of a criminal record. So my point is, as a person of color, it's, the chances, the risk of your coming in contact with the criminal juvenile legal system for some unfair, unjust reason is higher. And the consequences will be so much worse for you if you have lower income or of little means.
Thank you. I kind of want to shift gears a little bit, and at some point soon, I'm going to open up the floor for others. But these are really important questions, I think, that I'd like to try to address, and they're emerging in part with some of the conversations that we've had over time. A lot of times we talk a lot about the impact on Black boys or brown boys, whatever the case might be, and that's important, and we should do that. But I did notice that in this book you do reference Black girls quite often, and that they're woven throughout the book, as opposed to it being just one chapter. Was that intentional? And if so, why?
Yeah, it was very much intentional. In fact, when I was in the early writing stage, people would ask me, oh, are you going to have a chapter on girls? Or, how are you going to cover girls? And I was like, oh, I'm not going to have a chapter on girls, because girls are so extraordinarily, again, that word, interwoven into this conversation. And I didn't want girls to be an afterthought or, separated from this larger conversation about the criminalization of Black adolescents, for example. And that is not to say that there are not unique issues related to girls in the criminal and juvenile legal system. So I addressed those, but I wanted every single chapter in this book to also include girls, as if they were, as if I were talking about, the collective set of Black children. And so, again, the proportion of girls, though, in thinking about those unique issues related to girls, the proportion of girls arrested and incarcerated has continued to grow over the last 2 decades, especially for minor non-violent offenses. So, Black girls, for example, are 3.5 times more likely than white girls to be incarcerated. And also, Black girls have just not been spared, from the historical stereotypes that overstate and criminalize them. We think about, the terminology Jezebels, Black girls being fast and promiscuous and all of that. That stuff hasn't gone away. We may not call a Black girl Jezebel today, but the language is there, right? And it plays out in so many ways for Black girls in particular at school, in terms of school dress codes that are uniquely and disproportionately, targeting, Black girls, Black hairstyles being targeted in spaces in ways that, challenge, question their self-esteem, make them feel ostracized, make them feel like somehow the clothes that they're wearing is inappropriate, for them. I think it's really important to understand that even as the first juvenile court was founded back in like 1899, the progressive founders of the juvenile court viewed Black girls as beyond redemption. And that there was this belief, this myth that Black mothers could not raise, moral, well-behaved, sexually restrained daughters, right? And I truly believe the legacy of some of that attitude is still persisting, right? In the ways in which Black girls are, viewed, perceived, engaged with in school and within the juvenile legal system, and to be quite frank with you, in the policing of Black girls. One of the stories that I tell in my book is about a Black girl, a client that we represented, who very much was, to be, for lack of better words, was by all intents and purposes treated like a prostitute, right? Like the way in which to get her to snitch, if you will, on other kids who were involved in criminal behavior was to treat her as if, she was this, body, this beautiful body that could be complimented and teased and, ployed with in order to get her, to snitch on other folks in her community. And it was just sickening to me, but it just happened naturally without even a second thought. That's just not, and that's not the only example. I mean, we, hear stories, and those, I will say, I hope this is the extreme. Those are one of the examples that are the extreme, the treating girls like really like, physical prostitutes. But what I saw, in body-worn camera of police officers engaging with young girls, the language and the terminology and the attitude was very much this sexualization of Black girls, even if it wasn't true, like, sex trafficking of a Black girl, those kinds of things. So now today, I mean, you see that, I think our juvenile legal system invests very little time and resources in understanding and meeting the unique needs of Black girls. We put Black girls in restraint, strip searches, loss of privacy, emotionally isolating, punitive environments that trigger prior traumas. So we, and then we treat, that trauma, right, as criminal in and of itself. So it's really a vicious a vicious vortex, to be quite frank. The last thing I'll say about Black girls that I think that we forget about, and or any girls of color who live in communities that are disproportionately overrepresented in the criminal and juvenile legal systems, is that they are experiencing the vicarious trauma associated with the loss of their fathers, brothers, cousins, nephews that are being snatched out of the home. And I don't think we count that as its own source of additional trauma, right? So, yes, we see Black girls, Breonna Taylor, we see, Black girls being the subject of police brutality, but then they're also witnessing that brutality on the men in their communities. And that is a cumulative additional source of trauma.
Thank you. I appreciate your response. And it's caused me to think a little bit about one of your chapters. I mean, the name of the chapter caught my attention, right? And staying in this topic just for the moment, because it was also a chapter that moved towards solutions. And the title for your chapter 12 is entitled Black Boy Joy and Black Girl Magic, which that caught my attention, right? And this is where you begin to start to lay out solutions. How do we help Black kids? And you mentioned kids of color. I'm specifically in this moment speaking to it in that context, who have been living with the effects of hypersurveillance and over-policing all of their lives. And as you mentioned earlier, that includes the conditioning that begins very early on for children. What do you do about that? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I would say, my starting place is, look, well, we have to, there are a couple of things, because, I'll start with this notion of resilience. But we, as a first matter, we've really got to shift this culture of fear that just surrounds children of color, right? That so much of the trauma and the brutality and the disproportionate criminalization arises out of this narrative of fear. And it's a narrative that has been with us since the Emmett Till, lynching era, that, Black boys, for example, are sexual predators, all the way into the 90s with the super predator myth about Black boys. And now, even if we're not using that kind of language today, even though we're seeing it resurface, even when we're not using that language today, we are seeing it, seep back in now. And so we have to think about, one, how do we shift that culture of fear? We could talk about that. We also need to make some structural and legal changes that reduce the hypersurveillance that we've been talking about. But before we even get to that, I like to remind folks that in the meantime, while we're working to make those changes that we can talk about, is that we've got to restore the health and well-being of Black and brown children who are suffering from the mental health consequences of that disproportionality now. And so I mean, increasing the range of mental health supports for Black and brown children, both in the school system, in the community, both so that children can be healthy and not turn to crime as a manifestation of their trauma, but that they can get healed from the racial trauma that we've added, right, as a community and as a society. And so part of that comes from, and I think this is really important, the number one recommendation in terms of reform is establishing a public health framework for safety, right? And that is, instead of relying on traditional law enforcement strategies to keep us all safe, is that instead we rely on a public health framework that is trauma informed, that is attentive to nurturing and developing healthy relationships between adults and children, that is racially equitable, and that is restorative. And by restorative, I mean seeking to repair breaches in our society on a very practical level that goes back to having a continuum of mental health services, vocational services, peer interventions. It's about, restorative justice. It's about, in places where there is violence, it's about violence interrupters, credible messengers, people who look like the children who are engaged in criminal activity. So engaging around that. So a public health framework, investing in children, investing in families, investing in communities, instead of surveillance equipment, police and schools, things of that nature, I think are all sort of the starting point. I think for kids who have already experienced a bit of that discrimination and racial trauma, and mind you, I think that's virtually all kids today, as we sit here in 2023, who, because what the research shows is trauma occurs not only from being the direct target of police encounters, but also from witnessing, hearing about, police brutality on television, on the internet. Research shows that that vicarious, right, racial trauma is just as impactful as the direct, trauma, right?
Mhm.
Kids who see these encounters on the internet or on television can suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, even if they haven't been there. And so I think we've got to today create spaces, safe spaces for Black and Brown children to come together and talk about the experiences that they have, to talk about that the fears that they have. We hear about kids who are afraid to play in their front yard, who are afraid now to occupy parks because they are afraid of what it looks like. Children who see a police car and go inside because they're afraid of what an encounter might look like. That is socialization, racial socialization. That is a form of trauma. And so we need to think about that. Why? You know what I mean? No child should be afraid of blue and white, right? It doesn't make sense. And again, I want to be clear that this is not only a conversation about police officers in a blue uniform, but for all of society that polices, policing in quotes, Black and brown children. So those are some initial thoughts. I could,
Mhm.
go on about that. One other thing I will say about this, you all, is the other thing I like to say when I talk about this is that every single child in our country, and that includes in New Rochelle, needs at least, or is entitled to, at least one irrationally caring adult in their life. Right? One
Mhm.
irrationally caring adult. That means someone who will care so much for that child that, they won't embarrass them, they won't shame them, but instead they will love, accept, redirect them, hold them accountable, but not shame them, right? Be their shepherd through this process. And that every child would do even better to have a team of irrationally caring adults in their corner to guide every aspect of what they're dealing with on the education side, the mental health side, the vocational side. And a lot of us, maybe not everybody, but the majority of us on this call have gotten where we are because we had some irrationally caring adult that realized no matter how stupid, irrational, dumb thing I did when I was a teenager, I still loved you. I put you back on the right path, but I still loved you and I didn't shame you and bury
Mhm.
you under jail.
Mhm. Mhm. I want to thank you for this portion of our conversation. I have a lot more questions to ask, but I think it's time for me to open up this conversation to others. I think you provided us a framework to be able to do that, and I'm sure many people on this call, from a variety of points of entry, have some thoughts around some things that you were saying and some questions of their own. So I'm going to open up the floor. The floor is open. Keep in mind that we're going to share airtime, and that the idea is for us to be able to learn and to grow and to talk a little bit about what you've noticed and what do you wonder about. I see 3 hands up right now, or 4 in this order. I'm going to come across. And again, remember to share airtime. So we'll start with Bruce, then Margaret, then Aisha, and then Steve to start out.
Hi, Professor Henning, and thank you so much for this presentation. I'm learning so much from talking to you, and I'm really looking forward to finishing the book. I was so many things that you said really touched me, but one that I wanted to go a little deeper into maybe is this question of a public health model for public safety, which we've talked about a lot, and clearly makes enormous sense, at least to us. But it seems like an enormously difficult conversation to have, because, and I think the illustration of that is how for a minute in 2020 there was a conversation about defunding the police. The slogan, I think, confused people, but really the idea of diverting resources from state violence into state support is a very persuasive idea, and yet probably because of the weight of our history, it just swings back instantly to more violence, more violence. The answer to every question is state violence, and the more state violence is inflicted on people of color, the more people get traumatized, and the cycle just continues. So I'm really wondering if you have, from your conversations about this, and I'm sure you talk about it a lot, if there's a way that we can frame this conversation that can move it forward and get us out of this bind of constantly resorting to violence as the solution to all of our social problems.
Yes, that is so the $1,000,000 question. And I love that you're giving an example, from New Rochelle. I have the same examples in Washington, D.C. It is truly like, how do we get people to buy into a public health model? I think a couple of things that I will say is, one is finding courageous political leaders, right?
Mhm.
Courageous administrators in all of the critical offices that matter on this question, who will risk their reputation, risk their jobs, even at times, to stand by what the science tells us works, right? And that the social science says that it's more effective to provide a trauma-informed mental health wraparound, continuum on children than it is to punish them, incarcerate them, and police them. So if we take all of that research that's there, we share it with these courageous leaders, and we have courageous leaders say, I'm going to put my foot down, and I shall not be moved, even when the first high profile case comes along, a first high profile homicide or robbery involving a child, I'm not going to sway course, right? And so we've seen that in certain pockets across the country, and so that you get a bit more traction, at least for a longer time, when you have someone who's going to put their stakes down in this. And so, like, for example, so it's not perfect, but it's a piece of the puzzle. Like in the District of Columbia, we're seeing a lot of that push and pull. So you've got a mayor who is saying, crime is on fire, we've got to do something, hire more police, and we've got a prosecutor for juvenile court anyway. The city attorney general is saying, I'm not prosecuting this foolishness. And so, think about who's got power. In our city, we have an elected attorney general, and look, so some of the stuff isn't coming through. That person in power, progressive prosecutor, can put their foot down and hold the sway and insist upon mental health services. So that's one piece of it, having people in power in different places as often as you can. Works. We had it similarly. We've recently, that person moved on, but we had someone in power at the head of our Department of Juvenile Justice. And for years, no matter what was written about him in the paper, I'm not going to treat kids like animals. I'm going to treat them like human beings. So that's a piece. I think another piece of the narrative, even with our mayor who's been reluctant, around criminal justice issues, is helping her see how mental health dollars are needed, right? So even with her, very vocal crime is off the chain and we need more law enforcement, she also couldn't deny that we also need more mental health services, right? So having the research demonstrating the ways in which the research shows that children are in greater need of mental health care than ever before, had made her set aside, dollars in her budget for more mental health in schools. So it's a both and proposition. So notice my answer is not do it all at once. Like, we're not going to change all hearts and all minds in the same way, but can I get people in pockets, in places that will work? I'm trying to think of other things that we have done in that regard. Let me keep thinking as you all continue to answer questions.
Okay.
But part of it is power, part of it is social science, and part of it is getting that resource. I know one of the other fourth things I wanted to say is foundation dollars, more then increasingly so is to the extent, or I'm gonna call them foundation, I just mean private money, right? Is that looking for ways in which we can fund community-based organizations, community-based mental health providers, community-based alternatives to law enforcement, has also been successful. So finding that money is out there. Another thing I'll say with regard to educating folks is there are the likely allies or the likely advocates, that's the word I want to use, who often go to city council to demand change. In my experience, what we've been doing across the country is sending out psychologists, sending out social scientists, sending out folks who aren't, and sending out community voices, parents and kids, to go to the local legislative body and to make these arguments. So finding new messengers has also been useful. So,
Thank you, Margaret, then Aisha, and then Steve, and then others as your hands go up.
Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic talk, and I've really been enjoying the book. And one thing that struck me both in the book and then also in your comments, especially today, is something that actually resonates with my family. So starting with my grandma, so I'm old, so she's super, she's born in the 1880s. I have come from a family of public school teachers, all in Milwaukee. And one thing that they noticed, either as something that they were explicitly taught or as something that they just kind of incorporated and realized, was not correct, depending on their generation, was essentially that Black children should be ascribed with much more adult-like behaviors than their white counterparts. And I was wondering how much both, I think that clearly, is part of the narrative that you have in your book, but I'm wondering also if there are successful examples of how we counter this, as you put, very historic trope of Black children having more adult-like characteristics than any white kid would be ascribed to at that same age. And how do we what are the practical solutions or some of the solutions to giving Black youth back their childhood?
Really great question. Also, unequivocally, this book is rooted in an understanding of how adultification works. That goes back to your question earlier, David, about, is this more about class than race? This adultification phenomena is very much a phenomena of racial bias, unequivocally, right? For those of you who don't know this study, Dr. Philip Atiba Goff was one of the earliest researchers who, after Tamir Rice was killed and police officers kept talking about how Tamir Rice looked older than his 12-year-old baby face, and they focused on his size 36 pants, extra large jacket, that Tamir Rice isn't alone, that both civilians and police officers perceive Black boys in particular as more than 4.5 years older than they actually are. So like a 12-year-old Tamir Rice, easily perceived as 16. But think about it. How many of you all either have kids, work with kids who are 17 and 18 years old and know for a fact that 17, 18-year-old is still very much a child, in a child's brain and in child's behavior, but yet that 17-year-old Black boy is perceived to be, 22, 23, 24. So yes, the adultification phenomena is huge. And so we've been thinking a lot about how do you grapple with this adultification question. And part of it, it's just a small piece of it, is the play, recreation, and leisure. It's been very much been a part about trying to figure out ways in which we either as a legal right can codify. I'm saying that far more formally than I mean, but how we can honor and respect a right to play, and how does a right to play manifest in policy reforms. And so that is what they call police-free play zones, right? Parks and recreation facilities that are safe zones where kids can go and know they won't get, arrested, those kinds of things. play and recreation time, being recognized and honored, the ways in which all of the key state actors are required to learn the phenomena of adultification, right? Whether that be teachers, and so understanding that part of the solution is understanding you have a problem, right? There are so many people, and I love you all, right? This is a very informed audience. I go out and I teach about this stuff, and people are blown away by this idea that Black kids are perceived to be older than they actually are. And that there have been empirical studies demonstrating that. So some of this is about education on a very practical level, like on the police front. So like to avoid like a Tamir Rice getting killed, or to reduce some of the over criminalization. It's rules and mandates that require police officers to just pause and ask almost any question of a child, right? If you ask a child a question, their answers betray their age. And so what do I mean by that? You can tell from their dialect, their tone of voice, like all the things. When you pick up the phone and you speak to a kid, it's a kid on the phone, right? So requiring some of that, their intellectual developmental capacity comes out in one sentence, one answer very often. So it's just the slowing down. And I know people think, when we talk about police reform, people think, oh, no, a police officer is going to get killed if they don't act immediately. And it's just the research just doesn't bear that out. If we stop, think, and de-escalate, then we can get to the essence of childhood. So things of that nature, decriminalizing certain adolescent behaviors is another solution that ties to this adultification question. Making sure we understand and potentially even prohibit the prosecution of children under a certain age for certain things. It sounds more controversial than it is, but adolescent aggressive speech. How many of you have a teenager who has said to you at some point, I hate you, I'm going to I'm going to do something, absurd and impulsive. And of course, that's just adolescent aggressive talk. And so figuring out, prohibiting, prosecution for things like disorderly or curfew violations, things like that. So treating kids, that's again a part of that, preserving the right to have recreation, play, and leisure. So it's a lot of ideas in there.
Thank you. Aisha.
Well, actually, my question falls along the similar lines. I'm an elementary school teacher, and play is extremely important. However, it's been taken out of school, especially in kindergarten. Kindergarten used to be a place where you played and you learned how to get along with your peers, and you have that conflict resolution. In nap time, even things that kids may not have in other locations. How do we get educational freedom to give children a chance to play again and not be so academic, especially in kindergarten?
So I am going to put in the chat. So the U.S. Play Coalition is one resource. These doctors that we have found, Dr. Harrison Pinckney, Dr. Razul Moat, and there is a Black woman who works with them as well. And I always forget her name because she hasn't been able to join any of our events yet, but she's a part of she works with them very often. But they have been phenomenal. And I have to tell you, they have come to conferences. This is all in the last year. Since the book came out, we decided to really push this as one of the pieces that we wanted to grow from this book. But I think maybe having either some presentation at your school or for your school district, or coming up with a play plan, but what they talk about is like the research behind it, right? There is also the webinar. I for sake of time, I'm gonna type in. So if you Google Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic racial justice, it's going to pop up. And there's a page of all of our racial justice work. And if you keep scrolling, you'll see a racial justice webinar series. In that webinar series, you'll find two. We've done 2 racial justice webinars on Play. One was with Dr. Pinckney and Dr. Mowat. I thought very, very powerful. And then very, very recently, maybe even our last webinar last month, we did it with a woman named Linda Caldwell, who was she's retired now, but one of the early founders of sort of play as a necessity, developmental necessity. I think those are places to start in thinking about these questions. And you can get a flavor for Dr. Pinckney and Dr. Mowat. Tell them I sent you. They are phenomenal. Yeah.
Thank you. Steve.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Professor. I thank David for bringing you, Professor, to us and the book, which is awesome. And I picked up the book this afternoon because it took a while for my local bookstore to get it, and I did some speed reading this afternoon. You know, one of the greatest things in the book is just the contradictions that you show in terms of the treatment of Black kids and white kids. And I think of, you know, my best example of this is the ridiculous thing with Kyle Rittenhouse, who's walking down a street in Kenosha with an assault weapon, and the police are like waving to him. And you just sort of like change his skin color and what would be going on there. And the recreation thing, Ahmaud Arbery, and, you know, he's jogging. And so I agree with you on mental health. In New York, we raised the age for some crimes to deal with some of what you're addressing. What I'm interested in hearing from you today is the messages of your book. How do we get to not the victims of this, but the people that have to be sensitized to the biases that they are living with that are making victims out of others? And how do we, I think that's even harder than solving some of the other things, is how do we transmit those messages to change those perceptions and behaviors?
Yes, that is unequivocally the hardest, question. I also say, we need an entire cultural shift. It is what I talked about earlier, shifting that narrative of fear. Why is it that we live in a society that is uniquely afraid of Black and brown children? And how do we get around that? And so some of that, every space in which you occupy, you owe an obligation to get this message and educate the folks that you work with. So those of you who, you talk about being a teacher, Aisha, how in schools can I get folks to understand how bias operates, and doing so in a way, people don't, nobody wants to think that they're racist. Nobody likes that word. But how can, when I talk, I do, trainings all over the country on, and actually, David, you were at part of it. Like, how do you think about racial bias and how it operates in a day-to-day level? But just sort of getting people to grapple with that, whether it is every single person has a role to play, whether it's, reading books, having book clubs, right? Sharing examples like the one that you just shared. There are actually strategies. So I do my racial bias trainings are in the context of the criminal and the juvenile legal system. So I will literally just, have people, identify a range of everyday scenarios that they encounter in their local court and would never think of as racially biased in any way, or having a racialized impact on a recipient. And they're often blown away. Wow, I didn't think about that. Oh, I didn't think about that. Oh, I didn't think about it. So that's layer one. And then layer two is strategies for interrupting those biases, right? So how do I learn when I see it to interrupt it, right? So and it could be on the macro level. So again, coming back to Aisha, seeing that, kids aren't allowed to play. Well, what kind of school is it? Why is it that your set of kids, aren't allowed to play and have recreation? So calling attention to that racial disparity as an individual in whatever space you occupy in society, I think is critical. So I often say, it's, someone helped me see this, that, we live in a world in which 20% of the people that you have this conversation with, they knew it before I even opened my mouth, right? They see the biases, they know they exist. 60% of the people, though, haven't really thought about it. And if they thought about it at all, they haven't applied it to their day-to-day circumstances. They think they're immune, or they don't realize, to be quite frank, how bad it is, as you say, for the victims, right? So that's 60 people I can add to my list. That's 80%. And then there's 20% of the people that just may never get it. But if the 80% of us who care about this are making noise, speaking up, interrupting biases, then we can make a huge shift, right, in culture over time. So I just think about 20-60-20 rule and do what you can in your space. And so, that's a thought. I don't know how concrete that was. If you haven't, been to racial
A
bias
long
training.
road. Very good.
Yeah, thank you. We've got we've got about 15 more minutes, so we've got some other hands coming up as well. We'll hear first from Michael and then Justine, and anyone else for that matter we'll be able to get to. Let's start off first with Michael, then Justine. Your hands
So
are
thank
up.
you very much for coming to speak with us tonight. This is great. Reading the book was very difficult, and part of it was reading it. It was very difficult to have any sense of hope. How are we going to tackle the problem? And fortunately, your last answer addressed that. And you also mentioned that your book is being used as advocacy for legislation to change things. And explicitly at the end of the book, you say you're going to offer hope, and you give a bunch of strategies. But people, this is something a little unrelated, but I think it's a problem. So people are worried about school shootings. They're clamoring for more restrictive access to schools, more intrusive oversight of kids, more guns in schools held by adults, more police, and more surveillance. So I'm curious how calls at the end of the book for progressive reforms can be resolved or compatible with a push for more traditional policing and these so-called security measures that are being implemented in schools, really without any input from public. And I also see, and I brought this up also because I see it in NewRoAR with implementation of lockdowns, training teachers how to deal with physical trauma, closed campuses limiting community involvement, and also large-scale tactical drills by the police.
So I mean, again, you're asking all the right questions and all the hard questions, and it really ties back to this idea that we've got to stop the immediate shift back every time there's a moment of what feels to be increasing crime, right? And so, I hate to keep coming back to this, but it's finding those courageous leaders who will be educated on how what we are doing is ineffective. And I think that's what bothers me most, right? So the idea that locking down the schools, putting police in schools, all of those things helps the problem when it doesn't, right? The research shows that those strategies, by and large, right, might be effective for them. First of all, they aren't. Like, so for example, all the school shootings, right? They've had school police officers in those schools, right? And those school police officers have not been able to prevent the school shootings, right? And so I talk about this, I know in chapter 6 of the book, Cops in Schools, that I believed for the longest time that we have police in schools today because teachers and parents were afraid to send their kids back to schools after Columbine, right, in 1998. When you look back at the history of police in schools, you realize that police were actually introduced in response to conversations about integrating schools. That's you know what I mean? So it's a racialized history from the outset. So when you think about Sandy Hook, you think even about Columbine, all of those places had police in schools and have not been able to prevent school shootings. And so that the real effort, the real work has to be educating the people in power to believe that a public health, mental health approach is the more effective approach, less expensive, more effective. And so, I mean, that work honestly just, has to happen. Also the narrative, I think we have to call people on the narrative in very transparent ways. People are literally reverting back to the super predator, myth. And, yet again, who becomes the target of those myths? It's the Black and brown children, when so many of the mass shootings have not been Black and brown children. Like, that's the other piece of it that is just devastating. And so we have to be honest in conversation about what's happening, and that the fear mongering gets used against the most vulnerable kids in society. And we're doing nothing to help anybody, of all races and all classes, when we use our money in the wrong ways. I also think another thing, just a one tiny point, I know we got another person with their hand up, is understanding data management and media management. And the narrative is spun out of control. I will give you as fast as I can, a tiny example. In DC in February, there was a news report. The channel will remain, the network will remain nameless, but came out and said 75% of all carjackings in the District of Columbia are committed by teenagers. We have to get this under control. Well, my office, I have a policy wonk, a data wonk. He pulls the raw data. And we're like, what in the world? It cannot be true that 75% are carjacked. Well, guess what? Turns out in a span of about whatever, like let's say a year, whatever the span was, there had been 72 carjackings, 72. Only 4 of them had been closed with an arrest. That's it. 4 out of 72. Of those 4, 3 of them happen to be children. Why are they children? One, because children get caught. You know what I mean? And so they got their 75% out of 3 out of 4. Hello, the news headline should have been local police department only solves 4% of crime, or whatever it was, 10% of crime in the city, right? That should have been headline number 1. Number 2, right? There's absolutely no justification for an argument that 75% of all carjackings in the city was being by kids, because it was such a distortion of such a small sample. So that's what I'm saying. You see a lot of that data manipulation happening in the 90s is now happening again. And I just think we have to be careful. One of the recommendations I've been asking folks to do in local jurisdictions is to have, data watchdogs, right? Planted throughout the city. Somebody who knows who can access, who can get really quickly raw data and fact check, constantly the data and the messaging that's being sent.
Thank you. Yeah. Justine.
Keep it quick. That was a heavy one to follow up on, but I just wanted to point out some intersectionality here with environmental justice. And I was thinking about play and access to green space, and if you're growing up in the suburbs with a backyard, you can play with your toy gun and you can blow things up and nobody cares, right? But for kids, in urban spaces, there's often not enough green space and there's not enough play space, and that creates problems. And for kids who want to hang out at night, and things like that, or night, it could just be in the evening, whatever. But there's a lot of times not a good place to go. And so I guess trying to problem solve it, this is kind of big picture, but trying to figure out access to green spaces, public spaces, kids feeling safe in them, not over policing them, having accessible, affordable programming. A lot of, again, the class issue, a lot of families put their kids in summer camps. I know I did. But for some families, it's not an option. I know New Rochelle rolled out a STAR program this summer for kids to go to school. I don't know, school, if it was, I don't know what it was kind of like school, I heard, but it was a place for kids to go, at least. I wish it was more campy and more fun outside and a little bit less like school. But so it's just trying to think of solutions, I don't know if you can speak to that, but thinking about access to green space.
Oh, 100%. So Dr. Harrison Pinckney, Dr. Razul Mawad, they helped us really, some of their research and writing has really helped me open my eyes to that, right? And in fact, this part of the reason that the play scholars and parks and recreation scholars are in schools, I think it's schools of forestry and agriculture, is precisely because of the green space question. Like, that's how these questions, it's about city planning, right? It's about, you know, access and opportunity. It's the ways in which structural racism, housing segregation, all of those things, you know, locate, you know, people of color in communities where indeed there is a limited access to green space. So yes, so folks who care about, it's so interesting. And so I should just say, Justine, yes to everything you just said, was that you know, as I'm a lawyer, right? I'm a criminal defense attorney by trade, right? And I never would have thought that my work would intersect with environmental justice, or my work would intersect really quite directly with this play and recreation question. But indeed it does. That without green space, you leave Black and brown children vulnerable to being in public spaces, street corners, dilapidated parks, you know, in quotes, that subject them to hyper surveillance and criminalization. So I unequivocally, so that's another thing about the interdisciplinary nature of the solutions. All of you are asking for solutions, and part of it is working with other folks in other fields, right? You know, to show up at city council and talk about how important play and green space is to decriminalizing and to public safety and to all these things. And then also too, when you have green space, right, in, you know, a public housing, you know, place, can you have green space that is a police-free zone? Like, you know, and I'm saying that loosely, right? We have over-relied on traditional law enforcement strategies to keep you know, our places safe. So what would be the alternative? So you have the green space at the public housing. What else could be there to make sure those kids stay safe, short of law enforcement? So I agree with
you. Thank you, Professor Henning. We're at 8:58, and I kind of want to just ask this closing question before we end. You mentioned something to that came up in this conversation around having leaders that are willing to, you know, to stay the course, if you will, in spite of what might be going on. And I was glad that you mentioned that, because tonight we have individuals who are engaged in the political process, who operate from the standpoint of legislation. You know, we have our state assembly member on this call, we have our county legislator on this call, and we have a candidate for county legislature on this call in terms of Judah Holstein as well. And we have others that I won't necessarily get into that, but also in terms of our council district here, we have candidates on the call. That happens to be me in this moment in time, but that's not why I'm saying that. I'm saying this for this particular question because we really have a city in crisis, but they may not necessarily see it as such, particularly as time begins to move on. We've had 2 police killings in 3 years. You cannot wish that away. You can't guess it away. You can't deny that it happened. You cannot see, and when I say you, I'm actually encompassing that for all of us, because this is a all of us problem. It is not just a police problem, although in the context of policing, it is hugely a police issue that needs to be addressed. But here's the question, and it's the last question. What do you say to, we were talking about victims, but I want to think about it in terms of victims of systems. What do you say to Black people who live in communities that experience high rates of violence, whether it's state-sponsored, structural, as you mentioned? Those are still areas of violence. There are some Black communities, and in this instance, we're talking about New Rochelle, who say that they want police protection in their neighborhoods, as well as those who believe that they're being treated unfairly by the police. How do we navigate this in your experiences? How do we navigate this dilemma of an expectation for the fullness that should be occurring around your conversation around public health and the like, the fullness of that, and for the context of policing, how do we navigate that where people want it, but then they're treated unfairly by it? What are your thoughts about that as a closing response?
I'm on mute. I'm sorry, I was all excited. But such a huge challenge. We've seen this, like, you can have whole conferences on this very question, and people of color, sort of having the debate within themselves around this question. So, I mean, I like to think of it, I'm gonna see if I can come up with an analogy. It's like if my, my house is on fire and you can give me in this moment, right? The only thing you can give me in this moment is, I don't know, a blanket. I'm going to try to my best either to keep myself, wrapped, or to beat down the fire. But we all know that if I had something better, like a huge fire hose that would put out the fire faster, more effectively, and more permanently, then I would take that. My point here is this: we, first and foremost, it's validating the legitimate desire among all of us to want to be safe, period, right? I, as a Black woman, want to live in a community in which I am safe, period. But the question is, how do I get there? If I live in a city, I live in a state, I live in a country, and the only way that people are willing to help me stay safe is with police officers, then that's what I want. That's what I take. I won't even say that's what I want. That's what I take, because that's all that I have been given. That's all, in fact, that I know at this moment, is that police officers supposedly keep me safe. And so that's what we take. I think we have bought in, as particularly even as people of color, that this is the only way to keep us safe. But if we knew, I'm going to get to the question about mistreatment, if we knew that there were other resources that our state actors, our city legislators could be giving us a solution that was safer, more efficient, more humane, more consistent with dignity and humanity, I would take that instead. But nobody's ever given me that, right?
Mhm.
And so I guess that's what I'm saying. It's about helping communities see what the alternatives are. This range of mental health services, the public health response, literally having community meetings where we educate folks on alternatives to traditional law enforcement, because you have to have the community to buy into it to advocate, for city council. They're the constituents. So I think that's part of it. But we also have to, as a city, though, you can talk that talk, but you've got to meaningfully invest in it and allow for trial and error. I can't say that enough. So if I come up with, I don't know, criminal messengers, violence interrupters, and a mental health program, and I fund each of those at the absolute minimum, number one, they're not going to be effective. They're not going to be true to the model. And then the second that we have some sort of shooting in the community, we withdraw all of those funds and go back to traditional law enforcement. It's never going to work. So we have to meaningfully invest and convince, people of color that we mean well and that we're actively engaged with them. The second thing is inviting people of color in those communities that are most impacted to be at the table to come up with the solutions. And that includes young people at the table to come up with solutions that will satisfy an alternative to traditional law enforcement. So that's a second thing. And then the third and final thing I will say, this notion of, right, like, I write about this a little bit in the book. I give an example of a Black woman who literally is tired of crime in her neighborhood, but is equally tired of police officers treating Black boys badly. So she comes out onto the porch when she sees a police officer is going to arrest one of my clients. She comes out to the porch and she pretends to be sweeping, right? She's sweeping the porch so she can watch. and see whether or not the police officers are going to treat this boy safely or fairly. That's the word she uses. I just want to make sure y'all are going to be fair now. And she'll say to the young boy, I want to make sure, you don't have drugs in my neighborhood, but the police, you got to be fair too. So they want both things, right? And so I think part of it is acknowledging that in open conversation and insisting on, in my view, it's a gradual reduction of the number of police and a gradual increase in alternatives. And all the while, we have to mandate create laws that prohibit unnecessary, unwarranted police stops, frisks, arrests, brutality. So police officers have to be held accountable in the meantime, right? While we are working on this gradual reshifting, right, of the balance of funding and resources and priorities in our community. Because I'm not going to wake up, I'm not naive, and tomorrow all the police officers are going to be gone. So we have to have police regulations while we're trying to shift the culture.
Thank you, Professor Henning. I want to thank you for this really informative and engrossing conversation. And you are hereby now decreed an honorary member of NewRoAR to return at any moment in time, and a member of our New Rochelle community in various groups that are here that may want to take advantage of this resource that you clearly present to us and thinking about this more deeply, which we need to be able to do. Thank you again, and you are welcome again to come back. Know that in a couple of weeks, for the people on the call, we will also have presenting to us more specifically around this. Yes, please show her love in the chat before we let go. We're also going to have, and he wanted to come on board, Honorable Judge Rice to talk more about the opportunity program with all of you. So we want to make sure that we set that up in a couple of weeks. For our readings, you should move forward with chapter 2 and chapter 3 for discussion. As you're seeing in the chat, again, Professor Henning, thank you so much. You now have our link. You can come back at any time. You don't have to be invited. Just show up. We're here on Monday nights. And thank you also to others who are here tonight. And you don't have to go home like when we used to party, but or some of us still do, but you got to leave here. Thank you, political figures, Judah and Damon, as well as Steve, for being here tonight with us. And thank you for the advocacy groups that within our community have always been here with us, in terms of Aisha and Margaret, who are also engaged and involved and in collaboration with her. And thank you, NewRoAR, particularly the regulars that really fight this fight in a tremendous way. And thank you for those who were listening tonight. Thank you and good night. See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Night.
Good night.
Night.
Night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks so much.
Night. Thank you.
Night.